I want to tell you something a little bit personal about myself. I mean, ever since I have been a kid, I have loved crime novels, mystery novels. I followed the detective Philip Marlowe in Raymond Chandler's books. I watched as a kid Columbo and Murder, She Wrote, and then Miami Vice, CSI, Miami, NCIS, all of these crime shows. And the one thing that I learned through all of these, it was consistent throughout, is follow the money, and it will lead you to the truth. Our keynote speaker this afternoon does just that. He follows the money for a living, so he can figure out exactly what is happening. Dr. Ahmed Ali Attiga is the CEO of the Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation. He's previously worked at the World Bank Group's International Finance Corporation, where he supervised investment and advisory services in the Middle East. He's been an advisor to Saudi Arabia's PIF, Public Investment Fund, and worked at the Emirates Development Bank. And I can think of no better person to introduce us today to where the money goes into and out of the Gulf and into and out of the hydrocarbons business. So without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Ahmed Ali Attiga. Dr. Attiga.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador Zimmerman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me really, excellencies and distinguished guests, it gives me a great pleasure to be with you today at this distinguished gathering. And I really thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this very timely and relevant, I think, discussion, both to the Gulf states, which this institute supports, but also to the region as a whole, and maybe even globally. It's also good to see some good and old friends among the audience. I lived in this beautiful city for almost 8 years when I was with the World Bank, and it's very nice to come back to it. Probably I won't talk much now about EpiCorp and what does EpiCorp do. It's not a well-known, successful pan-Arab entity. However, maybe in the discussion there will be more opportunity for that. But I do lead the Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation. This is a multilateral financial institution that was established by the 10 Arab oil producers back in 1975, when there was a surplus that these countries, in their wisdom, I thought, wanted to channel towards supporting the energy and the petroleum sector of the region. And of these 10 member states, they are the Gulf states with the exception of Oman, and then you have Libya, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Algeria. And it is actually the only financial institution of its kind focused on the energy sector in the region. So this makes me being here today, and particularly given the theme of our conference, the challenge of the energy transition in the GCC, makes it quite relevant. As I said, maybe in the discussion I can relate a bit more into the role that EpiCorp plays in this regard. But let me talk a bit more widely and strategically about the topic that I was asked to cover today, which takes an extra importance, actually, in light of two recent events. Firstly, the reprehensible attacks on Saudi Aramco oil facilities in Bqaiq and Khurais, but also the unexpectedly measured response in energy markets as a result. These attacks, however, register a lot of firsts, and the longer-term implications are yet to be uncovered. And secondly, I think another relevant event that happened recently is last week's UN Climate Action Summit, an event which made it abundantly clear to us all that change is needed now more than ever. And this morning, many of colleagues who spoke, each from their own perspective, reflected on why action and change is needed. Not just for the viability of the industry, but for the very survival, I would say, of our planet. And here I quote Secretary General Barkindo of OPEC, who said at the World Energy Congress in Abu Dhabi 3 weeks ago, and he said, there are no climate change deniers in OPEC. So as industry players, I think we should be united in our belief that it's not enough to merely acknowledge that energy transition is happening around us, but I think also to actively embrace it. And it's our responsibility collectively and separately to do so. And I believe that our collective premise going forward can be summarized in one single word, a balance, a happy medium, a balanced approach. And I think a colleague from Chevron this morning, in response to Roger's very tough question, I think summarized it as also a balanced approach. Coming to the investment angle of how this premise ought to be addressed, APICORP, we publish an annual, it's the only actually publication about the MENA region investment outlook in the energy sector. This last publication issued a few months ago showed that over the next 5 years, the MENA region will need investments close to $1 trillion in planned and committed investments from 2020 till 2024-25. Digging deeper into this sum reveals an interesting trend also that ties back to the keyword I just mentioned, the balance, as we see other forms of energy steadily gaining on oil in terms of the share of the total investment, energy investment pie. The private sector also has quickly moved to take advantage of this trend. This morning as well, this particular element was emphasized. We note in APICORP's report that the share of overall non-government-led investments in the sector, in the region, have increased to about 22% from the year before, especially in the renewable energy space. This also includes significant investments even in the hydrocarbon-rich nations such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the region. Indeed, APICORP estimates that close to $350 billion could be invested in the MENA region's power sector over the next 5 years, with renewable energy accounting for about 35% of power investments. This was difficult to imagine just a few years ago, but renewable energy developments in the Arab world have gained tremendous momentum, and there are many reasons for that which we can cover later, but driven primarily by governments that recognize the urgency of tackling rising demand for energy, coupled with the declining cost of solar PV and technology. And countries like Jordan, Egypt, Morocco have all succeeded, in my view, and with my previous life at the World Bank and the IFC, multilateral development institutions have played a key role, actually, in the region to drive these countries towards a sustainable model of introducing and diversifying the energy mix. That's another element of financing that we can also focus on. However, there is still uncertainty in what will the future hold. This uncertainty, in my view, is primarily driven by a lack of decisive actions and policies on climate change and energy transitions in the region and beyond. One key reason for this uncertainty, and I think it's starting to be empirically actually looked at now, and we will, in APICORP, shed more light on it in our next report, is that the energy sector provided the lowest returns, less than 10%, in the S&P 500 over the last decade, compared to for example, the IT sector or the real estate, for that matter, which achieved more than 250% returns. So this is a fundamental structural characteristic that may affect or, again, drive the uncertainty going forward. So the question on everyone's mind becomes, how do we regain investor confidence in this industry? I think the industry will clearly have to demonstrate two main elements or two main features. Firstly, an ability to maintain cost competitiveness in established markets such as transportation and in new ones such as petrochemicals. And secondly, it needs to demonstrate notable gains in its all-cycle carbon intensity, including low-emission fuels, carbon capture utilization, and storage. I'm pleased, however, to note that the region I come from has clearly demonstrated that both features exist on both counts. It has the cost advantage, as well as the low carbon intensity of selected crudes. And we propose that the MENA region and the Gulf states will remain relatively strong in that regard for several reasons. We expect the region to maintain upstream investments relative to the size of the markets. In fact, major energy exporting countries are expanding their energy sectors and strengthening their positions in global markets. And while demand continues to grow in the region, maintaining spare capacity demonstrated its merits. However, the rise of US shale oil did bring into question several high-cost developments and additional investments in potentially unutilized capacity. Turning to petrochemicals, for example, which is a key component of how this transition is unfolding, projects in general have increased in size and complexity. In fact, the first crude oil to chemicals in MENA will be the $20 billion Saudi Aramco SABIC complex that will likely be commissioned in 2025. This mega complex will have a capacity of 9 million tons per annum and 20 million tons per annum in refining capacity. So, in essence, this could be a true game changer for the global supply and demand balance of major petrochemicals. Moreover, there are more positive signs coming from the region in this respect. Take an example of Iraq, a very important country for many, many reasons, and many of our distinguished ex-ambassadors here have served in Iraq. The government has prioritized and is rebuilding the downstream sector, for example. In fact, just over the last couple of years, we have monitored several projects that have progressed from planning to execution in a country that is still unstable in many respects. Speaking of investments, I'd like to shed light on also how the financing of these investments are taking a slightly different trend. Historically, a large share of the upstream investment was being shouldered by the equity of active national oil companies. The NOCs, they finance directly through equity or through some of their IOC partners. However, we have seen in the last 3 years two of the largest NOCs in the region resorting to financing through the debt market. ADNOC in 2017 and Aramco in 2019. Again, this is new, and I think a trend that ought to be encouraged and supported. More interestingly, we are also seeing the revival of the IPO activity, restructuring and unbundling of state-owned entities, sector reforms, privatizations, and bond issuance. This is quite a remarkable shift in such a short amount of time and was made based on strong conviction that this ought to be the direction to follow. So it's a win-win situation, if I may describe it that way. However, there are still unsustainable bottlenecks. In a large oil-producing country like Iraq, which I mentioned, which produces more than 4.5 million barrels per day today, substantial volumes of crude are still being trucked. Libya, my own home country, another regional oil producer, officially announced that $20 billion over the next 5 years will go to rehabilitate damaged oil and gas fields and infrastructure. I think that this figure is likely going to be insufficient. Another two features of the financing changes that are taking place in this industry are the ones that I alluded to, the private sector role and the role of the multilateral financial institutions in helping introduce public-private partnership financing schemes to this sector. Epicorp, as a multilateral financial institution itself, albeit much smaller than the ones that have played a bigger role, will continue also to support that direction. So all in all, it's a time of change. It's time that the oil and gas industry innovate in its own funding mechanisms. This will ensure sustainable developments of projects throughout the supply chain, at least during the next few decades, during which the world still needs low-cost, low-carbon oil. While the MENA market is undoubtedly on a trajectory of growth, we are aware of the various challenges we face. Some of these may seem daunting given the variety of underlying factors, geopolitical, economical, and others, and also the inevitable forthcoming energy transformation. But I'm confident that all of us, as stakeholders in this regard and in this industry, can overcome these challenges. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation and introduction to Epicorp's views of financing in the region. I want to ask you first a couple of primary questions. You focused a lot on climate change and changes associated with climate change. Do you see in investments that the Gulf states are making or they're attracting into their countries real commitment to climate change? And if so, I mean, where is that prioritized in terms of upstream, midstream, downstream, R&D, and other investments that they are making?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I did focus on climate change because the whole theme of this conference is the energy transition. And climate change is one key component of this transition. That's one reason. Another is to answer your question. The region has started on a very solid direction towards climate change policies, albeit at different degrees, at different successful maybe outcomes, but I think serious. I mean, I referred to my time at the World Bank, and it's not a secret. 10 years ago, maybe 15, 12 years ago, at the World Bank Board of Directors, when the issue of renewable energy and climate change would come, representatives of Saudi Arabia, of the UAE, of Kuwait, would strongly try to block the World Bank from going even slowly in that direction. Look where is Saudi Arabia today with regard to advocating a transition that strikes the balance. Look at where the UAE today in that regard. One of the largest solar power plants in Dubai, which APICOP financed part of it, is a major example. So I wouldn't say these countries will no longer advocate their bread and butter, which is supporting the oil and gas. At the end of the day, I think the last barrel that will be produced of oil will be from the MENA region. However, I think no one in that region is denying that this transition is there to stay, and they have to exploit it to the best of their interests.
You also mentioned that there has been the beginning of national oil companies from the Gulf seeking financing in private capital markets. I have kind of a two-part question. The first of which is, why do you see that happening? Why are they not relying, as they have in the past, on government investment? And maybe secondarily, what impact has that had on KPC, other national oil companies, or smaller producers in the region?
I think the reasons are many. Most of these countries, both producers and importers, have gone through fiscal pressures, albeit again at different manifestations, but real fiscal pressures. And I think that was a key reason for that. Secondly, I think in the new diversification and visions that these countries have adopted for their own economies, strengthening the capital markets, privatizations, have become objectives that these visions are trying to achieve. So they put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, by introducing these new financing schemes, and also bringing the private sector. Saudi Aramco did not need to issue bonds earlier this year, but they did it, I think, out of conviction as to demonstrating the benefits of starting in this direction. And what was your second question?
Will this be a trend with other national oil companies, either in the region or outside?
I mean, as I said, the region has also some countries that have not picked up. You mentioned Kuwait. I think that's one country where it relied too much on having their economic priorities very much linked into the oil prices. So when the oil price goes down, they start talking about reforms and trying to diversify. But the minute it goes up, that stopped. I think Kuwait, a country that I know well and I grew up in, has to catch up. So I think you'll find different degrees of commitment from national oil companies in the region. But the ones that have taken the lead, I think will continue to demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach.
I'm sure this group is also very interested in your thoughts on, in particular, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and his attempts to find the capital to finance his Vision 2030, the pending IPO for Aramco, some of the other maneuverings inside the financial world in Saudi Arabia to, I presume, to pull cash out of very wealthy companies. How do you see the IPO going, and will it start a trend?
Will it what?
Whether it will start a trend. But this is the first of many major IPOs for companies that seek capital to invest to develop their own economies and their own citizens.
Well, I think there are people in the audience here who are much better positioned than me to talk about the leadership of Saudi Arabia's plans. What I can say is that the country is very much serious about implementing the vision. Maybe it has not picked up momentum yet, but I think all the plans are serious in that direction. The Aramco IPO, I think, will be accelerated. How it will end up looking like, who's going to contribute, I think a range of options can unfold. But as a financing scheme that national oil companies in the region have started, I think it's a good demonstration. And if it succeeds, I think it will pave the way for similar schemes in the future.
You just glanced off the edge of my next question, which was, who do you expect the investors in the Aramco IPO to be? Will they be institutional investors? Will they be focused on Saudi investors, which seems to be the preference of at least some in Riyadh or in...
And there are many factors that will determine who. First of all, the location of the listing is an important factor as to who would be the first batch of investors who would come. Certainly, Saudi Arabia local investors, be it sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, wealthy family-owned industrial groups will take part. But I wouldn't worry too much about this. It's a process that has started, and it will go through ups and downs. There will be some teething issues like any similar process, let alone one at this magnitude. But I think it will show hopefully successful outcomes.
Now, I mentioned in my opening comments this morning my concern that politics was going to impinge upon economics, at least in the Gulf region, but potentially in the world markets. Maybe as a lead question, what have been the effects on financial markets of attacks on oil shipping off the coast of Fujairah, attacks on Saudi infrastructure, and most recently on Allee? How was that received in the financial markets, and is there nervousness? Because in looking at oil prices with the removal of virtually all Iranian oil from the market, with Venezuela down, Libya down, there's been very little price increase. Has the reaction been similar in financial markets?
I think we all know by now that the reactions have been restrained, both in the financial markets and in the oil markets in general. I think this is a reflection of how people are looking into this. In the oil market, I think the resilience of the OPEC, non-OPEC agreement has gone a long way in keeping this restraint in place. So it seems that short of, however, a full-blown, God forbid, war in that region, I think the producers have agreed to continue using the same model that has served them well so far. I think also the very quick recovery efforts that have quickly showed good results in terms of the facilities of Aramco have given confidence to the markets. And this is something I think to be appreciated. So we haven't seen any major, but that doesn't mean that the risk is over. The elephant in the room, in this room, and in the room we were in this morning is what's going to happen on the geopolitical front, both in the region and globally, particularly with the trade war risks and the like.
Let me ask specifically about the geopolitics of the Gulf, because that so affects oil markets and the financing we're talking about. On a recent trip I took to the Gulf, I felt very significantly different views in the best ways to address tensions between the Arab Gulf states and Iran, between government officials and private sector officials. With government officials having a much more hardline position and private sector officials looking for a way to calm the situation and continue trade as usual. If some of what we have heard about in French mediation over the past week and a half or 2 weeks is successful and there is a resolution of tensions between the United States, the Gulf Arab states, and Iran, and God forbid if Venezuela resumes itself and you have Iranian and Venezuelan crude coming back onto the market in relatively quick succession, I mean, over a course of months or a year, what effect will that have on the markets and what will that do to the Aramco IPO, investment in oil and gas, and financing for the projects in the region?
Well, I don't think I can predict how the confrontation or the likely confrontations are going to unfold. I hope that things will not explode. There are some very small positive signs coming out, as you mentioned. But if, the scenario you just described, if everything goes well and these positive developments take place, I think the oil producers will have to sit down again and chart a new framework along the same lines that they used with the OPEC, non-OPEC. Again, OPEC remains relevant, and I think it will play a role, be it to divert catastrophes or to take advantage of positive developments. So let's hope that the latter will be the case.
Now, since the theme of the talk, or the theme of the discussions today is energy transition, how do you see, you mentioned that 35% of recent investment in the Gulf has been into renewables. Mm-hmm. What do you see more broadly is the reaction of the national oil companies in the Gulf to the question of energy transition, and for what reason? Is it to free up more of their oil or gas for export? Is it to reduce their costs? Or is it because of political or moral or social pressures to diversify sources of energy and reduce mm-hmm. carbon emissions?
A very good question. Some of you may have attended the World Energy Congress in Abu Dhabi 3 weeks ago. And if you just read or if you heard the speech that the CEO of ADNOC has given and the CEO of Aramco has given, it shows you that what I just said earlier, that the conviction is real. Yes, it is a combination of diversification of the energy mix, which has become a priority for many of the oil producers. And they want to continue to show successes in that regard. That's why renewable comes, etc. So it is really the balance that we talked about is becoming a key feature of how these NOCs are behaving. That said, definitely they have to continue supporting as I said, the bread and butter of their economies, but in a totally different way now, along the lines that I described in my speech.
And With regards to the balance that we talked about this morning, there was also a very strong call for increased foreign and I think particularly IOC investment in the oil and gas industries, in the Gulf in particular. How are the NOCs of the Gulf actually looking at foreign investment? I mean, FDIs has not been high. Is this a message that is resonating with the national oil companies, or do the national oil companies prefer to float bonds, go to the international capital markets, and maintain complete control of the projects that they are doing, or whatever other answer you might want to come up with?
Yeah. I think some NOCs have worked well with selected IOCs to bring the investments to fruition. I think that particular relationship in the countries that have succeeded in it is one that needs to be, I think, both studied and repeated. Some countries have not. Iraq, for example, and don't forget, most of the oil producers, with the exception of the ones in the Gulf, are going through, in the region, are going through turmoils, be it Algeria or Libya or Iraq or Syria in that matter. So you cannot apply the same considerations on them or on their NOCs. And I gave Libya as an example. However, I think bringing the private sector, and the report I referred to by Epicorp has the details, and you can find it on our website as well. Bringing the private sector is a change that the sector has not seen before. My previous life, I was also a very strong advocate of the role of the public-private partnerships financing schemes that can solve some of the financing gaps. Be it in the energy sector or other sectors for that matter. So the NOCs, particularly these serious ones that we talked about, I think are going in a direction without any risk of reversing. And all these features that we described just demonstrate this.
We have also seen with Gulf money going outward in the past year, both Aramco and ADNOC investing in midstream projects, especially in India. We've seen Kuwait Petroleum build a refinery in Vietnam. A lot is going on in Oman as well. How do you see this trend, and is this a trend that will continue of Gulf investment offshore? Will it be upstream, midstream, downstream, or a combination?
You're absolutely right. This trend has also, maybe I did not mention it in my talk. This trend also is new. Many of the stable NOCs have started to do it, both in the region, going outside of their own, in the region and outside. And you mentioned some countries. Oman, for example, in the region is a country that is benefiting from this. Epicorp, we financed the refinery in Duqm that the Kuwaitis have done with the Omanis. Again, it's part of the more strategic priorities that these NOCs are chartering for themselves. And I think to the extent that these NOCs can continue doing it, they will.
What kind of investments do you predict or have you seen being examined for the future? This kind of investment in the Asian market from
I think the midstream and the downstream, particularly petrochemicals, and I mentioned a couple of examples on petrochemicals, will be key because many of the NOCs in the region, the Kuwaitis and others, have not done well in petrochemicals. And I think the chance now for some of them is to quickly rectify that. And the opportunities for investments in petrochemicals in India and in the Far East are there. But it requires seriousness, it requires capital, it requires political will.
And let me talk again about money coming into the Gulf, particularly in this case from Asia. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the general liberal way in which the Chinese are offering debt for projects to be done around the world and now increasingly in the Middle East. How is that affecting investment in the Gulf? What is the impact, and how do you think it's going to develop?
The Chinese have their own model. They've gone into Africa. They've gone into everywhere. I don't think they have come to the Gulf at the same manner yet. Certainly, if they decide to do, it may change the parameters of financing that I described today. But I'm not sure that they will be able to dominate. I also think that they have other priorities in terms of their geographic presence as investors, more important than coming to this region.
Okay. I want to ask one very broad question. As you look at the Gulf region and the Middle East, what do you see as the most significant changes that will affect the region and the hydrocarbons industry going forward over the next couple of decades?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important change will be change itself. So, and this is how I ended up my remarks. I think, again, one has to also qualify a lot of what you say. The region is not homogeneous in that regard. The region is going through unprecedented turmoil. God forbid the immediate future sees also the huge risks along the lines that we discussed today. Things will also be very critical. That said, however, the success stories that I mentioned today, be it in the diversification of the energy mix, in the financing schemes, in the climate change, embarrassing climate change, embracing climate change implications, I think you will see a continuation of that for the foreseeable future. Let's hope, however, that the stability of the region will not be jeopardized, because that can change the whole ballgame.
Very good. Dr. Attiga, thank you very much for being with us today for your speech. And
thank you very much.
Chris.